maybe, just maybe, at a time when clearly change is in the air, maybe, just maybe, we are turning the page on a dark part of American politics, because tonight the light overcame the darkness of negative campaigning.
Because of a huge voter turnout, and I say huge, we won because we harnessed the energy and the excitement that the Democratic Party will need to succeed in November.
Both John Kasich and Bernie Sanders, after last night's New Hampshire primary, Kasich ended the night behind Donald Trump by a substantial margin, but John was able to pick up the highly contested second place spot. And on the Democrat side, the Socialist Democrat, Bernie Sanders, beat out Hillary Clinton by a huge margin, a landslide, 60% to 38% of the vote. So what does that mean going forward, both to these two candidates, the two major parties, and quite possibly to November? To talk about it more, let's call on our panel. Skyping in from Florida's West Coast, Bonita Springs to be exact, Kasich supporter and my old colleague in Congress, Pete Hoekstra. And joining us via telephone, Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign advisor and Cornell law professor, Robert Hockett. Gentlemen, we thank you both. Pete, I'll begin with you. And of course, in New Hampshire, you have a situation where the undeclared voters can make a difference. Only 55% of GOP primary voters identified themselves as Republican. 42% declared they were independents. 3% said they were Democrats. Can Kasich keep those numbers up that we saw last night in New Hampshire as we move into states that don't allow a party preference declaration on primary day?
Oh, I think so. I think John, really pulled everybody together last night in New Hampshire. I was there with him for a few days last week, and I went to 4 of his town hall meetings. John has an amazing ability to connect with the voters, whether they're Republicans, whether they're independents, and in even some cases when they're Democrats. But no, I've got a lot of optimism that moving forward, John's message is going to resonate. Republican voters recognize that if we're going to win the White House, we have to appeal to independents, and we have to, potentially attract some Democrats. And so John demonstrated last night that if you want a winning campaign in November, you've got to look to John Kasich as being the Republican nominee.
Bob Hockett, as an advisor to Bernie Sanders, last night during that victory speech, it seemed that Bernie was channeling his inner Donald Trump when he talked about the huge win. It was huge. He trounced Hillary last night. But Bob, can Bernie keep up that momentum on into South Carolina and beyond?
I actually think that he can, and I think the reason is that he and Donald Trump are in a certain sense, tapping into some of the same concerns, and even, tapping into the passions of some of the very same voters, right? So a good many voters think that there's something that's fundamentally wrong with the way that we've been operating of late, actually even for decades. And in some cases, they actually both identify the same things that they think to be wrong. So, for example, our trade agreements with various foreign partners, including China in particular, it seemed to have operated very much to our disadvantage, and they seem to have hollowed out our manufacturing industry and to have hollowed out our middle class with that. And so Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders, I think, are both actually exceedingly concerned about that, and in many ways, their calls overlap, at least when it comes to things of that kind.
Yeah, Bob, as you're pointing us out, and Pete, we heard this during our days in Congress from no less a political observer and participant than Tom DeLay, who pointed out the political spectrum is not so much linear as it is circular, and there are times when two very different philosophies meet. It seems, Pete, that we have a situation where Trump is the capitalist populist and Bernie is the socialist populist. Is that going to be trouble for the Democrats? I mean, is there a stigma to socialism in your mind, Pete?
Well, obviously there wasn't last night. I mean, Bob, congratulations. Your candidate absolutely trounced Hillary Clinton. I mean, I don't think anybody expected that kind of support for Senator Sanders. I think, it's going to be very interesting as we move forward. And it's why a candidate like Kasich, I think, JD, you and I served with him, and they put him in the establishment lane. But if there's anything we know about John Kasich, this guy is a change agent, and this is a guy that gets things done. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this populist notion plays out. I actually think that John's going to be able to tap into it as well.
Well, I don't know. You know, I loved working with John on the budget. Obviously, we all work together in Congress. This whole thing about the border still concerns me, quite frankly, about John, but let's see how it plays out. Bob, last word to you. We've got about a minute left. The stigma of socialism, is it all gone, or is there a situation where young voters around the country hear the term socialist and they confuse it for being sociable?
Well, there might be a bit of that, but I think the other thing is that the other reason that there's not quite the same stigma is I think people are paying a little bit more attention to what's meant by the term, right? As you know, it's sort of a notoriously slippery term, and different people seem to mean different things by it. If you look at the things that Bernie Sanders is calling for, he actually sounds an awful lot to me like an Eisenhower Republican. And in fact, the top marginal tax rate...
Whoa, Bob, wait a minute. Bernie as an Eisenhower Republican? Very quickly, 15 seconds. Give me an example.
Well, so the top marginal tax rate under Eisenhower was over 90%, and the top rate under Bernie would be about 46%. So in that sense, right, and for calling for massive infrastructure investment, which is also what Eisenhower did, that, you know, the highway system is all thanks to Eisenhower. That was an Eisenhower initiative. So socialism is a bit of a misnomer applied to Bernie when we're thinking in terms of European socialism.
All right. Well, fair enough. We may have, I think that may be some radical revision of history, but Bob, we'll have you back. Gentlemen, to you both, we have your thanks, and there is more ahead as Newsmax Prime continues.